posse.
Introduce Roman Waschuk to you, who's going to speak in a moment. I'm not going to go through the details of his background, which is in the thumbnail, which I know all of you as disciplined conference goers have read and therefore don't need refreshing. But in terms of takeaways from that thumbnail, I'd just like to mention a couple of things. One is that it clearly indicates the extensive experience in the whole of Eastern Europe that Roman brings to the topic. He's served in Ottawa in divisions and places that deal with the study of Eastern Europe. He's obviously done it abroad, including a stint in what we might at the moment call the heart of darkness in Moscow. But he brings a perspective out of all this, and he brings it not just as a recent ambassador to Ukraine, but of course also an ambassador to Serbia before that. But he is staying currently involved in both what you might call the resilience and, for that matter, the continued economic development of the Ukraine by serving as the business ombudsman for Ukraine, which is a very active role with it. And if you look at its website, the number of investigators, I have to say, as an old CSIS employee, we would be delighted to have that many agents on call. Anyway, Roman, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you and to be introduced by a former boss, boss man of what was then, I think, still foreign affairs and international trade, has now has a slightly less felicitous acronym of GAC, but let me maybe give you a kind of a resilience snapshot circa February 2022 as a bit of a framing exercise for what I'm sure the next speakers will be talking about in terms of the war and how it has progressed. So I left Ukraine as ambassador on Halloween of 2019, flew away, and returned beginning of January 2022 with an incredible sense of timing to take up the position of business ombudsman in Kyiv. I was following the news, obviously, and had a conversation with some people in government who told me, Roman, you might not be doing what you think you're primarily supposed to be doing for the first couple of months there of your assignment. And I said, but I'm contracted to do all this stuff. They said, well, you're going to have to adapt. And sure enough, there was a mention of, did people get it right in terms of anticipating what might happen? I'm going to engage in a bit of characteristic or uncharacteristic self-congratulation here and point you in the direction of an interview I did with Paul Workman of CTV on the evening of February 23rd in a hotel room at the Hotel George in Lviv in terms of what might happen. I'd say I don't need to probably retract any of that 10-minute interview. So what was I seeing and what should we probably try to see in terms of Ukraine as it was then and as the foundation for what we see now. And I'll deal with a bunch of sort of shibboleths about Ukraine, conventional wisdom shibboleths. Ukraine, the economic failure. Those of you who may follow the macroeconomist Adam Tooze will know that in January, February of 2022, he wrote a whole series of tweets and articles pointing out the incontrovertible macroeconomic basis for Ukraine to implode almost immediately, especially compared with Russia. But that wasn't quite right. Ukraine had actually had its highest dollar-denominated GDP since independence in 2021, just over 200 billion US. Businesses were intending to invest more and more. Now, again, this does not obviate the fact that my investigators and I are still employed dealing with the problems that business experiences in Ukraine, both domestic and foreign. But nonetheless, it had adapted to the challenges and was developing actually quite nicely. Does Ukrainian business consist only of oligarchs? People write about oligarchs a lot. Vis-a-vis Ukraine. Certainly, they had been dominant prior to 2014 and, in fact, had managed to survive and adapt themselves in the 2014-2019 period. There's even a gentleman in the UK, David Dalton, who's done a PhD on the successful adaptation strategies, both economic and political, of Ukrainian oligarchs. But at the same time, there was a large group of self-made new entrepreneurs, companies like the logistics whizzes from Nova Poshta, which actually puts most Western delivery services to shame. People in sectors such as agri-food, where Ukraine is not just a bulk producer, it is that, but has also moved into processing, and also in IT. So whereas 5-6 years ago, if you looked at the Forbes 20 richest Ukrainians list, you would have primarily oligarchs and primarily people from smokestack industry. By December 2022, out of the top 20 on the Forbes Ukraine Rich list, 6 were from the tech sector. The tech sector is one that has developed without state assistance. It's one that is whose main markets are North America, Western Europe, Asia, and one where people are literally synchronized with the rest of the global business community. Ukraine also a country imploding demographically. That's actually partially true. It is a country in demographic decline, has been, from 52 million to around 41, I would say, as of February 2022. But the natural corollary of that would be that must have been accompanied by a huge brain drain. That is less the case. The brains mostly stayed in Ukraine because of favorable tax treatment, especially in the tech and IT sectors. The Ukrainian IT sector was growing at about 25% annually. By 2021, a turnover of $7 billion, a workforce of 285,000 programmers, voted by Global Source, the Global Source Awards, top delivery destination in the world for 2021. So Ukraine is kind of like a highly functioning dysfunctional state, if you will, which is paradoxical, which makes it hard for Ukrainians themselves to understand what's going on, much less outsiders to fully grasp what's going on. So you have these large islands of success against a background where other sectors are in crisis or failing. And therefore, Ukraine often described as Europe's poorest country. Poor Ukraine. Except when you look around, it doesn't look so incredibly poor. And then people fleeing poor Ukraine end up in Winnipeg and sort of wonder, it's not looking so much wealthier than anything we left behind. You should read some of the fora on social media of people recording their impressions of arriving in various places. So GDP at purchasing power parity, 2021, $14,219, which is a lot more than nominal GDP. Which is also because price structures are different. Anyone who has tried to run a mobile phone in Ukraine for about $8 a month with unlimited data and then ends up in Canada will know how purchasing power parity can work. But even purchasing power parity GDP officially reported does not cover fully Ukraine's thriving shadow economy. And the shadow economy doesn't include only like super criminal stuff. It includes stuff that is just slightly off the books. And in that sense, to abuse even more comparisons, I persuaded my former Italian colleague on arrival that Ukraine is a sort of Slavic Italy. The government may not, they may change, etc., but life, it goes on, and people find ways of moving forward. Ukraine, synonym of corruption, mega corrupt place. True or false? Again, kind of both. 116 out of 180 in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index in 2021. But if you talk to the Transparency International Ukraine people, they would say, we don't even trust our own index. Not because the index is corrupt, no. But because there had been so much investigation, both investigative journalism, so much institution building around corruption, constant international discussion about it, that in fact the perception is probably greater by now than the reality, as even some of the anti-corruption activists will tell you in an unguarded moment when they aren't asking for the next corruption-fighting grant. Ukraine, land of the East-West political divide. You've seen the maps. This is the electoral map of Yushchenko versus Yanukovych, or somebody else versus somebody else. Except that in 2019, and I lived through this whole election campaign and then the denouement and the inauguration, President Zelensky won 73% of the vote across the country. He carried all but one of the 24 regions that at that point were fully or partially in government control. Now, ironically, his opponent, the previous incumbent, President Poroshenko, had decided to build his campaign around 3 pillars. And those were army, language, and faith. Which he tried to contrast against the, are you going to risk your future on some comedian guy? And the final phase of that campaign was a billboard campaign across the country featuring the darkened face of one Vladimir Putin, saying, do you really want to risk this guy coming in? And of course the electorate by and large said, oh, come on, scare tactics, you're just covering up for your buddies and their contracts, whatever, we'll take a chance. But there's a certain inevitability to the geopolitics of being Ukraine that meant that if you watched President Zelensky's Easter video recorded message. It consisted of him standing in an embroidered shirt with a combination of tridents and crossed swords, talking about the importance of the army, speaking Ukrainian only, and located in the background for the video was the Kiev Caves Monastery, from which his regime has just is in the process of driving out the Moscow-controlled part of the Orthodox Church. So he was basically conveying the entire Poroshenko 2019 campaign package in that one video. So it shows you that life has its way of organizing things. Ukraine, country of weak governance. I used to spend my time going to endless meetings on donor coordination meetings on governance about Ukraine, and consultants coming in, and you probably know lots of consultants too who've done this, telling Ukraine what to do. Right now, I would say that Ukraine has a very cohesive leadership group around President Zelensky. Some people might almost say overly cohesive group. They have managed to find trusted managers for key state-controlled sectors, which have performed well. The rail system, defense industry, the post office. The post office is very important for handing out, because it handles pensions in Ukraine, etc., and of course issues those fantastic stamps marking various crucial moments in the conflict. And I guess one of the last shibboleths was Ukraine must be militarily weak, because it doesn't have a whole lot of planes, and if you just stacked up the numbers, which is what the bean counters especially in Washington tended to do, there's no way these guys could have lasted more than 3 days. But I think that ignored the fact that Ukraine also had close to 500,000 veterans of the lower intensity Donbass war by 2022. So this is a huge reserve of people who you could call upon, or who would show up themselves, even if you didn't call them, to defend the country. And battle-hardened. These are not theoreticians here. And there's also the contribution that the training quint, the 5 countries that were most engaged, that included Poland, that included Canada and the US, Lithuania, the UK, had made between 2014 and early 2022. Canada itself, Canada's portion of that was about 30,000 Ukrainian armed forces troops trained. If you multiply that by 4 or 5, it means over 100,000 had received NATO-aligned training there. So you also had sort of latent capabilities. One of the things that President Zelensky had done, and much criticized for it by his opponents, is that he had dropped some of the Poroshenko more ambitious military procurement plans, especially in rocketry. They were associated with some of these people who had been targets of campaign messaging in 2019, and so they were de-emphasized. Had they been more vigorously pursued, Ukraine would now be in a better position to respond long distance in terms of threats. But the knowledge and the prototypes are hiding in there somewhere. And we discovered that last April when the Neptune missile took out the Russian Black Sea flagship Moskva. And I would not be surprised if in a forthcoming counteroffensive we discovered that there's not only stuff that Western countries have supplied, but also things the Ukrainians have been quietly beavering away at for over the last year and a half. So together, these are all elements of resilience, sometimes a bit counterintuitive, not always drawing on the standard Western playbook. And I'd give it as an example, again, the railway system, which has been a mainstay. You can imagine if Ukraine had done exactly what all the consultants were telling it to do, and had split up Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukrainian Rail, into a rail-owning sort of infrastructure company, a passenger company, a freight company, added in some competing jurisdictions, et cetera, all kind of market model, and then you wanted to re-amalgamate all of it to facilitate warfighting, would have been chaos. As it was, the unreformed Ukrainian rail has performed very well. There are, though, still major risks. One would be a sort of privatization of the spoils of victory, because I think victory will inevitably come, and socialization of costs. So it's important that basic fundamental transparency in governance has to be there to maintain the confidence of Western, not only Western actually, because they include countries like South Korea, they include countries like Japan, also very engaged now in Ukraine, but supportive partners who are now financing half of Ukraine's budget. Transparency has to be maintained. And a need for Ukraine to become positively attractive. Ukraine managed to achieve quite a lot by being merely tolerable for its population and its business community, who adapted and managed to make a lot of things succeed anyway. But in order to bring back the millions of Ukrainians who've gone abroad, some of them will be driven back to Ukraine by Canada's mobile phone costs, but the country needs to have a kind of positive magnetism agenda for why not only Ukrainians but also others will need to come. Ukraine, I think, after this conflict will become more diverse. It will need skill sets of people who did not originally come from Ukraine to help it rebuild. It needs to become a net people attracting country. That's not something it's used to doing, and it will need all the help of its consuls general to do that. EU integration will be very important. Obviously, a key decision last year, and a reframing of Ukraine in terms of the of European discourse as one of us. When senior officials in Brussels talk about Ukraine, they don't talk about them, they talk about us. And that's a huge change. But there are capacity issues around that. You can have too little convergence in governance. Ukraine is partly, I think it's over 70% of EU rules have already been put into Ukrainian legislation formally, but mentally, in terms of how it's administered, that hasn't always happened. Or, as we saw over the past week, you can have too much Ukraine doing too well in some area, such as grain and agri-food production, when you had briefly, and I think that's going to end tomorrow, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary shutting their borders to Ukrainian grain because their own farmers are saying, wait a minute, these huge shipments are depressing prices, and being nice to Ukraine means being nasty to us, your voters, your key voting blocs. So it's a challenge for Ukraine. You're either accused of doing too little or too much, but that is the sort of the challenge that the entire Ukrainian political class, but especially President Zelensky and his team, will need to deal with over the coming months and years. So that's kind of what I have to say, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. The stuff that we don't see on TV and whatnot. Maybe you can fix that part too. But Ambassador, what about Ukraine's industrial capability? When we're looking at this foreseeable year coming up, will be absolutely critical for them to try to expel Russia, and because time is on Russia's side. The good news story you said about the industrial capability, or does Ukraine have the ability to sustain an offense for this year to push them out?
Okay. Maybe the next speaker will answer that. But no, it does have the repair capacity. It has the technical capacity. It has lost some of the fundamental industries. I mean, obviously, Azovstal, for example, famously defended in Mariupol, was destroyed. And nobody is going to rebuild a 1928 steel mill today. Now, that actually also has an impact on the political balance, because, what has happened to a number of Ukrainians' leading oligarchs is not creative destruction, it's literal destruction of physical plant. A lot of their legacy assets have simply been blown up in this conflict. But does Ukraine have tank repair facilities? Yes, it does. Especially for former Soviet equipment. I think for the Western stuff, it'll need to go across the border into Slovakia, Poland for maintenance. Where actually Ukraine is developing a lot of expertise now is in building UAVs. Long-distance UAVs, and if you've seen the videos, dropping things of various size on the enemy, rather unexpectedly taking them out. And I'll give you another example here of sort of business, military, civil society convergence. One of Ukraine's leading gas station chains, called Oko, which happens to also mean eye in Ukrainian, ran a promotion for 4 months called Oko za Oko, an eye for an eye, a sort of a vengeance-based gas promotion, where if you bought a liter of their premium gas, 1 hryvnia out of that, which is about 3 cents Canadian, would go to buying long-distance drones. With one of the biggest Ukrainian army-supporting charitable fund. They collected 375 million hryvnia, which is about $10 million, through that promotion, and set up so it's not only 27 drones, it's the whole kit. It's the van that goes with the drone. It's the antennas. It's sort of a whole high-tech setup, Ukrainian designed, using cameras, some of which I'm pretty sure came from Canada, because we are very good in these sorts of optics. But it's a kind of collective help for self-help. When they completed this and they rolled out the 27 drones, I saw people on their social media page going, why do we need to buy gas now? If we're not we're not buying drones, vengeance drones, like what's the next offer that we can help pay for? So Ukrainians have been very good at self-organization and sort of horizontal cooperation. Final note, I see that I'm about to be thanked whether I like it or not and pushed off the stage. There was an interesting feature article in the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, an interview with 2 Ukrainian anarcho-socialists who serve in a drone detachment, who've signed up. They figured once the bombs started dropping, they thought their previous pacifist approach to life no longer really met the requirements. But what they've done is they've use their kind of anarcho-socialist tendencies to source anything that the official state army command structure was not providing. And so that is a lot of what has kept Ukraine going, is that even where official structures haven't succeeded in providing everything required, civil society, including a lot of people who've been collecting money and running bake sales in Canada, et cetera, have provided what's missing, both whether it's people on the sort of liberal side, on people on the radical nationalist side, or anarcho-socialists, because at this point they all feel they're in this together.
Roman, I don't want to trivialize anything that you've said, but for those of us here in Canada, we feel that many gas chains are conducting a vengeance. Well, I expected an awful lot from our speaker, and I think we got even more. He punctured a number of bits of conventional wisdom, and I think in doing so he provided much more than the snapshot that he described he was going to do, but really a full and nuanced picture of where Ukraine was, where it is, and a little bit of where it's going. And I think most important, or not, I shouldn't say most important, but very important, the picture of development and adaptation in Ukraine, I think, is something that we should all register and reflect upon. So thank you very much for the contribution, and we have a small token of appreciation, and we thank you.
Thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.